evening, everyone, and welcome to our program tonight. My name is Jennifer March, and I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Relations here at Columbia School of Social Work. Welcome to our program. It's going to be really wonderful, and we're excited to have you join us. And now I'd like to introduce Dean Melissa Begg. Dean Begg is the 18th Dean of the Columbia School of Social Work and started in September of 2019. We are so glad she's on board, and now that we are all back in person, we are delighted to see everyone again. So thank you, and Dean Begg, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jen, for that nice introduction, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad you've been able to join us today. We're going to have a fascinating conversation, I'm sure, with my wonderful new colleague, Dr. Brenda Jones Harden. We'll have an opportunity to hear more from her about the effect of trauma on young children and their families and the implications for social work practice. I'm delighted to say that Dr. Brenda Jones Harden will join Columbia as Professor of Social Work with tenure on July 1st of this year. Now, New York is not new territory for her. She previously worked right here at Columbia, I think in the law school. Brenda, it's a delight to welcome you back, and we're counting the days till we have you here. There is no doubt in my mind that you're going to be a superb member of our community. I'm looking forward to it. But a little bit more about Dr. Jones Harden. She's currently the Allison Richmond Professor for Children and Families at the University of Maryland School of Social Work. She's also president of the board at 0 to 3, a nonprofit dedicated to ensuring that all babies and toddlers have a strong start in life. Now, Dr. Jones Harden is a scientist-practitioner who uses research to improve the quality and effectiveness in child and family services, and also to inform child and family policy. Let me add that that's very consistent with the university's so-called fourth purpose, to make sure that what we do in the academy leads to real world benefits. Now, her research focuses on the developmental and mental health needs of young children who have experienced early adversity. She began her career as a child welfare social worker, working with vulnerable children in foster care. And her experiences as a clinician ignited her long-term research interests in child well-being. Dr. Jones Harden is not only a child welfare expert, she's also an outstanding researcher whose work spans early childhood, child development, child welfare, prevention science, enabling her to evaluate the impact of programs and systems on child well-being for the most vulnerable children. She's written over 24 book chapters and has published extensively in leading peer-reviewed journals that span the fields of child and family studies, early childhood health education and development, psychology, and mental health. Dr. Jones Harden holds a bachelor's degree in social science and Spanish from Fordham University, a master's in social work from NYU, we'll forgive you for that, Brenda, and a PhD in developmental and clinical psychology from Yale University. We're delighted to welcome her here today to review the evidence on the epidemiology and effects of trauma and share trauma-informed interventions using a prevention science perspective. And lastly, but not least, hot off the presses, as of news I received today, the university trustees at Columbia have approved Brenda's appointment to a named chair. She will be joining us as the Ruth Harris Ottman, class of 45, Professor of Child and Family Welfare. This is a fantastic recognition and a mark of great distinction for this wonderful scholar. Brenda, thank you for joining us for today's conversation. So to get us started, maybe you can take a few minutes to tell us in broad strokes about your career and what led you to the research that you're doing.
Sure. As you said, Melissa, I am coming home. I'm sort of coming full circle back to New York City, where I started my career. I won't tell you how many years ago, but as a student at NYU, I was one of the first 4E program students that was in existence. And I did my 2 years of field placement at what was then called Special Services for Children, and now I think it's called ACS. So it was that experience that motivated me to remain committed to children who came into the child welfare system and to understand them a little more deeply than I did as a young clinician. I felt like I was pretty good at engaging families and things like that, but many of the decisions I made back then, I think I wouldn't have made now, not only because of the level of experience that I've gained, but also my very careful decision to pursue a doctorate in a field that allowed me to understand children's development. And I'll give you just one quick example from a time when I was working with a family, opioid using family with 3 beautiful children. And I will never forget this, although this was many years ago, where the child had no language. And it never occurred to me or my supervisor to make sure that this child had a language exam so we could know whether the language had to do with, trauma related mutism, or whether the language problems had to do with language delays that more related to her cognitive capacities.
Right.
So part of what my career trajectory has been is integrating my skill at being a practitioner, working with families who experience an array of risk factors, with the knowledge about children's development and mental health that allows me to help clinicians in the field of child welfare and home visiting to understand what we should do to promote children's positive developmental outcomes. So I really feel like this was the right place for me. I'm glad I got those 2 sort of very different skill sets, very different knowledge bases that really helped me, I think, not only to make better decisions about children when I think about it from a practice perspective, but also to teach the next generation who are going to take over from me soon, but also to really ask the kinds of research questions that I think are critical to ask.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thanks for that introduction, Brenda. And about the research you want to share with us today, I think you could maybe give us a sort of the overview of before we dive into questions, sort of in broad strokes, what you're focused on and why.
Sure. So Erin, if you'd pull up these slides, I promise everybody, I know this is a conversation. This will not be a whole hour of showing slides, but I thought it might be good for you all just to see a little bit about the epidemiology and why I focus on little kids. And these slides come from 0 to 3. You heard Dean Begg say that I'm the president of the board for the next couple of years. And these are some slides that I constantly use when I'm going out sort of touting the importance of thinking about very, very young children in the child welfare system. So in case you all aren't familiar with these data, what we do know is that infants and toddlers under the age of 3 are the ones who are most susceptible not only to maltreatment victimization, but to also removal from their homes. So if you look at that long red bar at the bottom of the graph, you'll see that children under 3 enter foster care at a much higher rate than children who are in any other age group. Part of this is because social workers thinking wisely. These are children who can't protect themselves, who can't give voice to when somebody's abusing or neglecting them. So social workers err on the side of caution, which makes sense. But what it suggests to us who are interested in sort of revising the child welfare system to be more developmentally sensitive, that we need to pay particular attention to this group. You can go on to the next slide, Erin. So part of what we know is that when we think about all the children, and these data come right from the national data in CANS, the big child maltreatment report that's free, that you can download, that comes out every year, that you see almost a third of the victims of maltreatment are under the age of 3. Next slide, Erin. And again, when you think about this across the country, you see that it's a particular problem in many states. Part of the reason is because of poverty. And one of the things that I hope to talk to you all about is the correlation that we know exists between poverty and child maltreatment. And one of the issues, of course, is that children who are growing up in impoverished circumstances are much more likely to end up in the child welfare system. Okay, next slide, Erin. And then this is just a similar slide that says to you again that 1/3 of the kids who are coming into the foster care system are under the age of 3. Go ahead, Erin. And this is the last one, basically showing you again that when you look at this, it's an issue across the country, particularly in rural areas, as it turns out. So we see many more young children coming into care in rural areas. So that's all I wanted to show you. I just wanted to make the point that when you think about young children in the child welfare system, they really are the ones who experience the highest rate of victimization and the highest rate of foster care placement.
Right, from the earliest days.
Yep, yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Brenda. So I have a number of questions I'd like to pose to you, and then I think some questions will come in from our audience today as well. But let me start here. You're talking about early childhood adversity and trauma. And trauma seems like a really broad term. How is it conceptualized in the field currently?
Well, my favorite definition emanates from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. I really, really like their definition because they look at trauma from the vantage point of children. And one of the things that they argue is that trauma is not just about direct victimization. It's about exposure by virtue of experience. So community violence is trauma. But the other thing that they say is that for young children in particular, it is an experience that poses a real or a perceived threat. In other words, children's perception of their safety, children's perception of when they're being cared for matters. It's not just whether or not they have actually experienced it. The other reason I like their conceptualization is that they help us think about trauma in sort of 3 buckets. They think about acute trauma, like these single event things that, for example, one could argue that acute trauma is what children have experienced when they've gotten, been involved in a school shooting, right? That is a serious trauma. It is a one-time event. There are also trauma that is recurring, right? Traumatic events that are recurring. So when we can almost think about, school shootings as recurring trauma in our society now because they keep happening over and over and over again. But then they have this third bucket. And one of the reasons that I appreciate this third bucket, it really does define the trauma that children in the child welfare system experience. And those are multiple events, so they're recurring, happen over time. But the other piece about it is that the trauma is often of an interpersonal nature. In other words, the person whom you depend on for your safety, for your care, for your nurturance, may indeed be the person who is exposing you to the trauma. So if you think about community violence, for example, that is trauma that really is a distal occurrence. And if you have a caregiver who takes care of you, that person can help you modulate yourself and be able to cope with the traumatic event a little better, not terribly better, but a little better. But if the person who you depend on for this nurturance and care and sensitivity is the one who's imposing trauma on you, then it takes on a different kind of nature and is sort of seen as the trauma that's hardest to intervene with.
I see. Thank you. Really comprehensive. Now, you are, as you showed us those slides, you're really focusing on young children. Why is it necessary to consider their development, children's development, when we think about trauma or other types of adversity that they might experience?
So there's so many reasons, but let me just try and say what I say to clinicians when I talk about this, that it's important to have a developmentally sensitive approach to addressing trauma, to understanding trauma, to thinking about its implications for children, for trying to figure out what intervention you're going to have. I do a lot of training of social workers, and I say to them, one size does not fit all. You have to really think about what it means for the particular developmental group. For example, I just showed you those slides about how very young children are most likely to be victimized by trauma. They have no language. They have no words. So we can't sort of do what we can do with a preschooler or a school-age child and help them use their language to create a trauma narrative. And we've got lots of very interesting clinical as well as research data that suggests creating that trauma narrative, where you can create a story or draw a picture or something like that, really does help you cognitively understand what you've experienced and be able to move toward healing, right? Well, little kids who don't have the capacity to do that need a different kind of approach. Similarly, adolescents who want to tell you to be quiet and leave me alone about my trauma might need to be a part of a healing group where they're around peers who have had similar experiences to them. So really understanding the child's capacity to process the trauma, to understand what the implications are, and to be able to move toward healing require an understanding of what their developmental milestones are, but more importantly, what their developmental capacities are in terms of cognitive processing, in terms of language, et cetera. So one of the things that I'm really, really invested in is having social workers think about very young children. Like, I don't believe a 2-year-old needs to be in psychotherapy. I just don't. It's just sort of one of those things that I take a hard line on. They don't have the cognitive and language capacity to understand it. So what I would like to see for very young children is more dyadic kinds of approaches. What we learn about in infant and early childhood mental health, for example, where the social worker's job, the clinician's job, is to support the parent, that parallel process, so that the parent can do what they need to do to be responsive to the child, to give the child the message that they're always safe, that they're going to work hard to protect them. So that's the kind of thing that I think is critical about taking a developmental approach. And, you know, I've written this book that I need to rewrite, but it was a long time ago, called Infants in the Child Welfare System, where I also argue that that should really cut across not just our clinical approaches in terms of intervention, but also the decisions we make in terms of placement, in terms of how many times children are moved, in terms of visitation, and all those kinds of things that we have to do in child welfare practice.
Yeah, that all sounds critically important to actually have impact. So thank you. I know there's also a burgeoning area of research around the effect of trauma on children's brains. And so I'm wondering what's happening in that area. Can you share with us a little bit of what's developing in that domain?
Sure. And I often think about how many years ago when I was in social work school, of course, we as social workers knew that trauma impacts children. We knew that. We could tell people anything. But now that we've got these beautiful images of the brain, we can take those to legislators and we get a lot more money than we used to get. I mean, we're not sort of viewed as these do-gooder social workers when we take a nice picture of the brain and show a congressperson, for example, or a senator in these beautiful images what trauma means to the brain. So some of the data, this is still sort of cutting edge and it's just burgeoning. We're going to just see a lot, but it's because we have these non-invasive procedures like MRIs and EEGs and PET scans. Before, we would need to, you know, sort of do an autopsy, but now we've got these non-invasive ways of learning about the impact of poverty and trauma on children's brains. So one of the things that we know is that the brain doesn't grow, right? So we've got these beautiful elegant studies from children in institutions like in Romania, for example. Those studies would never be approved in this country, but we've got them from these Eastern European countries, et cetera, that show that the lack of stimulation, the lack of nurturance, the lack of sensitivity really leads to smaller brains. So that's one thing that we know. But the other very interesting thing that we know is that that kind of experience of trauma, and by the way, one of my favorite Gandhi quotes is poverty is the worst form of violence. So I really love that quote because what it suggests is trauma is not just physical and sexual abuse, but it can be what your experience of growing up in an impoverished neighborhood can be. But that research, including some where they've looked at compare children in poverty to children in poverty who've experienced trauma, et cetera, they have found that there's certain parts of the brain that are most likely to be impacted by these adverse events. For example, the frontal cortex, which I say to my teenage kids, your front brain, like Pooh says, I say Winnie the Pooh, because I have adolescents, think, right? So they know what the front brain is, right? Not because they've read my articles, but because I've said it to them a million times, use your front brain. But that front brain is affected. And all of you who've had a brain kind of training know that that is the part of the brain, that prefrontal cortex, that frontal lobe that's responsible for higher order cognitive processes, that's responsible for executive functioning, which Jack Shonkoff's group calls the air traffic control system of our brain, that does things like help us to control our impulses or help us to focus on something like that. So that really does help you sort of make the decisions you need to make to learn in a classroom, but also to get from point A to point B. So that part of the brain is affected by trauma. But also there are these deep structures that are in a part of the brain called the limbic system that's sort of underneath all of this higher order cortical kind of structures that have little things like the amygdala, which is this tiny little almond-shaped kind of structure that really is implicated in things like detection of threat and being able to know when somebody's approach to you is neutral or dangerous. So we see impacts on that little part of the brain. We also see impacts on a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is like that seahorse looking thing that really is implicated in things like learning and cognition. So we wonder why children who've experienced trauma can't learn in their environments, partly because of those kinds of things. And one interesting thing about the hippocampus is that it also is a seat for memory. And as it turns out, memories that have a lot of emotional salience are particularly held in that structure. So we see that kind of thing. So the deep-seated nature of some of those memories that children have about trauma that allow for that kind of re-experiencing of the trauma, et cetera. And then there's the myelination. That's that kind of little fatty sheath that coats the neurons that makes the neurons much more effective. And what we know about little kids is that when you're born, right, your brain is just like working overtime. So you're getting like all these neuronal connections, a million of them a second, it's been reported. But what happens as you live, it's sort of like the brain is being primed to deal with whatever environment it comes to, whatever environment, right? So what happens with that myelination process is that that fatty sheath grows around the neuron and it makes the brain more responsive to what the environmental stimulation is. So, but what happens is once you get sort of your brain figures out, well, I'm in this environment and I don't really need Mandarin, for example, because I'm growing up in the US and everybody's speaking English to me. So I don't really need Mandarin. So the parts of the brain that are sort of primed to deal with all these kinds of new language inputs get pruned away. And so the myelin happens in the parts of the brain for which you get environmental stimulation for. So think about what that means for a young child experiencing trauma, right? The parts of the brain that are around being hypervigilant, that are around being hyper aroused get solidified, and the parts of the brain that might be around down regulating, calming yourself, coping with stress are pruned away. So we should not be surprised when we see these children exhibiting the kinds of problems that they're exhibiting. And then there's this other little part in the limbic system. And what it does is it allows you to figure out whether you should focus on things, but it also helps you to kind of make decisions about threat and those kinds of things. So the bottom line is it affects the brain at the level of growth, but also at the level of how it functions, how efficient it is. So again, we have known about these problems, but now we've got these images of the brain that tell us what might be at the physiologic core. We could go on and talk about other kinds of things. We see lots of asthma in impoverished communities with children who are exposed to trauma. There's a paper that I love that says trauma gets under the skin. We've learned about these physiologic processes, but certainly at the level of the brain, we've learned quite a bit.
That is remarkable, and hearing about how finding this, documenting the physiological manifestations is maybe more persuasive to Congress people.
They like brain pictures.
All right.
They don't like to hear from do-gooder social workers, but they like brain pictures.
Yeah, figuring out how to persuade is critical to all of this. Thank you. So we know that one of the consequences of trauma exposure is PTSD, right? And so how does that manifest in young children from your experience?
So I think it is a good framework for us to understand what trauma means for young children, but we have to really think about how it manifests as different from how it's manifested in older adults. For example, we know that re-experiencing is one of those hallmarks of trauma exposure, PTSD, right? Well, it may not just present itself as nightmares for young children. You can see it, the play therapists who work with traumatic children who've experienced trauma can see it in their repetitive play, for example. So that might be where you look for it, in their repetitive play. Also, things like hyperarousal. We know that, certainly dysregulation is part of that hyperarousal, but we also know that young children might look like an ADHD kid. So they might be running all over the classroom, and we're quick to say, well, let's get this kid a trial of Ritalin, when really we should be asking, why is that child behaving in the way that they are? Right. And maybe the ADHD symptoms are a result of this kind of hyperarousal that you might see. The hypervigilance that you might see in young children. One of the things that we know about PTSD is it makes you, you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. So you hear a car backfire, like they learned about soldiers, and they think somebody's shooting them. For little kids, it could look very differently. Like it could be, I'm just listening for the ambulance. Is the ambulance coming outside and going to take my mommy or daddy to the hospital? Does that mean somebody's getting shot or something like that? So we have to really ask the question about what this is causing children to exhibit. The other thing that we think about are things like regression, right? Particularly with young children. So children who've met certain kinds of milestones, they might be potty trained fully at age 3, but they have some kind of traumatic event at age 5, and you'll see them going back to a place where they really, have to wear a diaper or something like that. So although the framework is good, again, I think a developmental understanding of what it might look like for young children enables us to see the signs more clearly, but also know how to intervene in their lives, I think, in a better way. So instead of, for example, punishing them for externalizing behavior problems in the classroom, for being aggressive or something like that, we might want to also think about what is leading to those kinds of problems, right?
Right. Doesn't come from nowhere. So
Right.
what is it? Right. That's great. And just thinking about this, you're talking about what happens during early childhood in response to these exposures, and both in the brain and behaviorally and otherwise. But I know a part of your research focuses on how that exposure to trauma manifests in later functioning. Can you talk a little bit about that and what happens to the children down the line?
Sure. And I think I want to start with that question by going back to the brain development literature.
Okay.
I mentioned to you that we know that early brain development is amazing, right? That children have all these neurons that are forming, et
Yeah,
cetera.
you said like a million a second or
A
something.
million,
Astounding.
right? Neuronal connections. Yeah, a million a second. And we do know that they get pruned off. Remember, they get pruned off later once the brain sort of figures out what kind of environment I need to adapt to. But we do know that because the brain is so plastic during the early years, for good reason, right? Because you want the child to be able to adapt to whatever environment he or she finds himself in. You know, I always use the language data, but if you're in a country where they're speaking Mandarin, or if you're in a country where they're speaking Amharic, or you're in a country where they're speaking Spanish, you want the child's brain to adapt to that environment. And that's what happens, right? That is a beautiful part of plasticity. The not so beautiful part about plasticity is that if you don't get the kinds of experiences that you need to be the best you can be in terms of a problem solver, in terms of a emotion regulator, in terms of a coper, in terms of somebody who has good social skills, right? That it makes it harder for you to do the things that are required of us as humans. Not that it's impossible. I mean, we know from lots of data now that although the genesis of neuronal connections is really at its height during the early years, fortunately, even people my age can still develop new neuronal connections.
Good for us. Yeah.
But it's harder. It's harder. Like it's harder for us to learn a foreign language. I'd like to use these language examples. It is not as hard for a young child to learn a foreign language. If they're exposed to multiple languages, they will have the right accent. You and I will never get a Japanese accent because we're getting this exposure at a time when it's harder for our brain to respond. So for what that means for children who've experienced trauma, it means that, doesn't mean you can't get over it. It means that it's harder to. It's harder to. So what we know, like I'll use another example, externalizing behavior problems. We can sort of predict which kids are going to be aggressive and have emotion dysregulation in the early childhood period. We can sort of look at kids and know this kid is on a trajectory, right? So what that means is a couple things. One, that the child is probably more susceptible to the impacts of later trauma because they've experienced it early on, which makes them more vulnerable. But what it also suggests is sort of like a cascading effect, that you experience it early and then you add multiple other experiences on, and it sort of says to the child, I mean, we can talk about this on a physiologic or a behavioral level, that life is not going to be what you expect it to be. You are not going to get the nurturance that your brain and that your body and that your spirit expect. So what we see is these children getting worse and worse over the years. Now, again, I don't want to paint this, moribund picture. There are things that we can do, which is why we want to get in there and do something as early as we can. And there's a great return on investment slide that I often use that the economists have done, but also the public health people, that suggests you just get more for your buck, if you want to think about it from an economic perspective, if you intervene early than if you wait until an adolescent is exhibiting behavior problems that land them in some kind of detention center that costs society a lot more than it should, but also costs that child a lot more in terms of their life experience. So,
yeah, thank you for that. So you're pointing to things we can do, and that's, I think, one of the most beautiful things about the arc of your research, because you're not just documenting behavioral and physiological results of early childhood trauma. You're also investigating how young children can be buffered against the negative effects of early trauma. And so can you talk a little bit about this? Are there ways we can do that and intervene a little more in detail?
Sure, absolutely. And just to your point, there's no way you can get social work training and not think you got to do something about what you're studying. So,
exactly. This is what's beautiful about your research. It's also beautiful about what social work research is, right? It's taking this and finding a way to have impact and to improve well-being for the long term. So
you gotta get in there and try to do something.
Yeah.
So, I really like the public health approach, or maybe I'll use what CDC terms as a multi-level approach, right? Okay. And what they talk about is the import of doing interventions at different levels. So they start with primary prevention. And one of the things that comes up a lot in primary prevention are things like income supports, right? Like there are data now that suggests in states where there's expanded Medicaid, where there are, different TANF regulations that are more positive, that you see lower rates of child abuse neglect. Now, those aren't causal studies, but certainly that is an argument for making sure that every family has a basic level of income that allows them to be self-sufficient and to take care of their children appropriately. And there is a great new study that is being done. It's called Baby's First Years Project, where they're actually giving families who are low income an unconditional cash transfer just to bring them out of poverty, to see if you can see better developmental outcomes, but they're also going to look at maltreatment. So that might be our first, we'll see what the results are, our first causal study that suggests that you can lower maltreatment rates with this unconditional cash transfer. So that idea of primary prevention, sort of what goes to everybody to make everybody able to provide the kind of life that children need. Then I like thinking about secondary prevention, which is really most of what I do, which has to do with looking at families who might be at high risk for trauma, for maltreating their children, for example, and doing some kind of intervention that allows them to improve their parenting, but also allows for the improving of children's outcomes. So one example is early care and education. There is quite a bit of evidence now, even in terms of maltreatment. Like I think about the Chicago study that was looking at early care and education as in Chicago, right, with mostly low-income African-American children, and they have found lower rates of child maltreatment in that early care and education program. Similarly for early Head Start. So something like that, where children's developmental outcomes are improved, but at the same time, what these programs often offer is additional support to the family. Again, preventive kind of, things like parent groups and things like that, helping parents understand the importance of development that look like they can have an impact on child maltreatment. So those kind of secondary prevention programs. Also, home visiting programs. I never thought I'd see this in my lifetime. As a young social worker, I did home visits all the time. Who knew that we would have a national policy around home visiting, what we have with maternal, infant, early childhood home visiting program, McV, but those kind of home visiting programs can be provided at the secondary level as well, like nurse family partnership, those kind of programs that really are designed to try and get to families to improve their parenting and improve the outcomes. And then, when you think about prevention at the next level, you can think about families who have other kinds of risk factors that make them prone to child maltreatment. So you think about things like substance use or mental health problems, or families who, have already maltreated their children, who've been involved with the child welfare system. So those more intensive programs that really are designed to improve parenting that's pretty compromised already, but also to provide services that link families with these other kinds of services like mental health and substance abuse. And there's some beautiful examples of those, like bringing a cognitive behavioral approach to depression in a home visiting program, or connecting the home visiting program with somebody who provides drug treatment. So that kind of collaborative effort has been found to really not only improve the parenting, improving children's outcome, but also to address some of these kind of risk factors that we know end up with maltreatment. And then finally, there are a ton of interventions that have been found to be effective. Like I think about child-parent psychotherapy, for example, or another one that has been found to reduce child abuse is parent-child interaction therapy, those kind of interventions that are really designed to address the needs of family where trauma has already happened. Like with CPP, it's intimate partner violence or maltreatment, those kind of interventions for children where maltreatment has already happened. And there's some research that can reduce the level of maltreatment, but also do these wonderful positive things like make parents more sensitive to their children, improve children's language outcomes, things like that, beautiful outcomes. So, we have these wonderful clearinghouses that tell us the evidence base, what these programs are. The challenge, of course, is to bring them into the child welfare system and implement them at scale. That's the challenge. But fortunately, people are working on those all the time now, trying to really think about how to implement these programs that have been developed in, one locale or with one group of families, how to implement those writ large in the child welfare system.
Oh, that's a beautiful description. Thank you. You've walked us through documenting what happens through the prevention science, and now through the intervention science and implementation science of how we know what to do. There are things we can do that have an evidence base, and how do we get the uptake that we need? So there's a challenge for everybody listening, right? So as you think about it, Brenda, what are your thoughts about how the child welfare service delivery system should intervene with young children exposed to trauma? And I feel I want to raise at the same time, there's understandably a lot of concern about racism in the child welfare system. So maybe you can touch on that as you talk about, types of interventions that you think could be best.
Sure. So first of all, and I'm sure many people on this call know about the Upend movement, which is a movement afoot to really abolish the child welfare system, partly because of issues of race, which I will touch on in just a minute. Thank you for asking that, Melissa.
Yeah.
But, maybe because I was raised in the child welfare system, I started my career in the child welfare system, I don't go that far where I say, let's abolish it and start from scratch. However, I am completely clear that there's a lot of work we need to do with this system. Completely clear. And I think one of the things that we have to do is really focus more seriously on prevention. I think we are bringing still, and certainly there are a lot fewer children coming into care than there were when I started my career, but foster care should be the last resort. It
Right.
really just should be absolutely the last resort. And all that money that we spend on keeping children in foster care should be repurposed to provide the kind of preventive services that we need. But, you know, some families need a lot. Some families need a lot. And so sort of once a week, 90-minute home visit is not going to cut it. They need a lot more intensive kind of support. But in my estimation, that is certainly better than re-traumatizing children. And that's how I think about foster care. And I'm an adoptive parent myself, so I understand about taking children from foster care.
Right.
But when you separate children from their families of origin, in my mind, we are re-traumatizing them. So I would rather spend our money and our skill and our expertise trying to keep families together. I think in the end, it's better for kids, it's better for families, it's better for society. But it's gonna take more than what we're doing right now, right? We have to be clear about what works. I mean, the kind of loosey-goosey stuff that I was doing, for example, as a young social worker is not going to cut it. Case management is important, but you got to have case management plus. You got to make sure that parents who are depressed get mental health treatment. You got to make sure that parents who are substance using get substance using treatment. You got to make sure that babies who we know are most likely to be maltreated and they're coming home to substance using moms, we need to treat it like in some other countries, like a public health problem. And we put those moms and babies in a residential drug treatment program, which seem to really work. They really seem to work. They're expensive, and we don't have a lot of beds, but those seem to really work. And it's certainly better to pay up front than pay the, you know, millions of dollars that we're going to pay later when these moms can't keep their kids and they have to go into drug treatment. So we have to really think carefully about prevention. The other thing that we have to think about is really saying that child welfare can't do this by themselves. They just can't. We don't have enough dollars. We don't have enough of a workforce. There has to be some sort of system level change where somebody at the top who's responsible for child welfare and child care and mental health says, we're going to put all these dollars together because the families show up actually in all these systems, but we're going to do this in a way where we create a system of care for kids where they can get access to all of these things through one portal instead of, you know, us sending families from here to there and yon and not getting the services they need. So some kind of system of care that allows when a family, like I often say to social workers whom I work with, the first thing I would want to do with a young child is get them into quality childcare, right? That's number one on the list.
Yep.
Why? Because they're getting an opportunity to get their developmental needs met while we're working with mom, but also moms get a respite. I mean, that kind of connection should not be where a social worker has to go out and look for a childcare program and see if they have an opening and that kind of thing. So we need to do that kind of systems level thing. But the other thing I'll say is it really needs to be developmental. We need to sort of, again, going back to my one size does not fit all, we need to think about what adolescents need. We need to think about what school age children need. And certainly we have sibling groups that include kids from all of those vantage points. But if social workers, and I'm really upset that we don't do more training about development in social work schools, but if they sort of had that notion, they would know that, okay, I need ABC, attachment biobehavioral catch-up for the kids who are under 2, but I might need to move to the incredible years for the kids who are 2 to 7 or something like that. So you understand the needs. And then finally, I want to raise the issue that you raised about race. So as you know, it's a huge issue in child welfare. It's just huge. We know that, for example, African-American children are disproportionately in foster care. We know that they're more likely to be substantiated and all those kinds of things. And they're really sort of two rationales that have been proffered for this. One is that African-American children and some Latino children, not all, like in my area, we work primarily with Central American families, and those communities wrap their arms around families. You hardly ever see those children coming into child welfare. I know in New York, you often see children from Puerto Rico and from the Dominican Republic coming in, but our Central American families hardly ever come into care. So it's interesting with the Latino community, you kind of have to look at the country of origin to look at disproportional rates, et cetera. And Asian children, as many of you know, really are underrepresented, if you will, in the child welfare system. But African-American children consistently are overrepresented. Although if you know the history of African-American children in the child welfare system, you'll remember a time when they weren't allowed in the child welfare system, when we had segregation and other kinds of things. But anyway, now they're overrepresented. And the one idea is that it's because of poverty. Like, we know the high correlation between race and poverty in this country. There are all kinds of research that tell us that. So African-American children are more likely to come from impoverished neighborhoods and all the risks that that entails, okay? But the other sort of characterization is that it is a result of a racist system. So if you think about, for example, structural racism, right? And we know that African-American children are more likely to grow up in impoverished neighborhoods that are segregated, where the schools are horrible, where there are all these environmental toxins that cause asthma and all that kind of stuff. That makes sense, right? Structural racism leads to them more likely being at risk. But also, those neighborhoods are also more likely to be surveilled. And this is what the upend movement gets so upset about, right? You have a bigger police presence in these neighborhoods. You have health facilities and educational facilities that are more likely to report these children who are growing up in these segments of the community. So we have that as a problem. But then the other problem that has been reported in the literature is this bias in decision making, so that when you ask social workers, and this is not just in the social work field, they found this in education as well, that when you ask professionals to look at a Black kid and a white kid who present with the same risk factors, the professionals are apt to say that the Black child deserves more engagement in the system. So they found it in educators, where they're more likely to say the Black child is a problem and should be expelled, right? And in the child welfare system, this child that needs to go into care, it should be more likely that this child is substantiated, et cetera. So that kind of racism in decision making is also a big issue that we have to come to terms with in this, as we try to revise this system that is in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I know there's a lot of strong feelings all around, and it's great to get these perspectives, particularly for someone who's studied this for decades. So we're, as always happens with these, the time just flies by. Our hour is almost up, and I know we've gotten a number of questions beforehand and in the Q&A now. So folks want to hear more from you. So I think maybe we could ask you this first. We have a lot of social workers listening, right? And so what can we do as social workers? What can social workers do in this arena to ensure better outcomes and well-being for children across the life course?
Well, the one thing I would say, and I have had to push myself on this a little more, is I'm a clinician, so a lot of my work is based on interventions with individuals and families. And I think one of the things that we have to do, going back to our social work roots, is think about the totality of the experience and think about the structural issues that we learn about in social work school that affect parents, like, poverty, like not being able services, those kind of systemic things. And I know we can't take on everything, but one piece of our code of ethics is that we're supposed to be advocates. And so I would challenge everybody to find a space and a place where they can be an advocate. Mine is through 0 to 3. You know, I found my little organization. That's where my advocacy work happens. And it's about improving the lives of infants and toddlers. But everybody can find their own little place and organization that they're going to work on and, you know, donate their dollars, but also maybe, you know, write their Congress people or provide testimony. So I think we ought to go back to our code of ethics and find that place. I also think, and I say this to my students a lot, and I will actually hearken back to something someone said to me when I was first starting social work school, and that is, you have to be okay with making a small incremental change in the lives of people. And if you can't do that, you're in the wrong field. So how I've adapted that to myself is say, okay, I'm a cog in the wheel, I know that, but there are many, many, many cogs in the wheel. And if we all kind of get our cogs together, the wheel will go, it will go. So really figure out who you are, what you're best at, and don't try to be all things to all families and all things to the field, but really find a place where you feel like you can make a contribution. And then the last thing I'll say that's I think is so important, but it doesn't really relate to what you're asking, except it's part of a trauma-informed approach, that we have to take care of ourselves and make sure that the secondary trauma that we feel doesn't get in the way and doesn't burn us out and doesn't make us want to quit the field and become, you know, a worker at Starbucks, right? That we want to hopefully stay in the field. So finding a way to, you know, get away from the work and calm ourselves down and give ourselves some joy and take care of ourselves, I think is just as critical for making the work happen as being very skilled at being a practitioner or a researcher. So yeah. I always like to close with that.
That's beautiful. Thank you. As someone said to me recently, you know, just being joyful at times in our world is a radical act in itself, right? And that's important to remember, that we need to be radical that way. And just building on what you just said, which I loved about, you know, doing your part, whatever cog you can be in this larger system. Someone has suggested in the Q&A tapping into the unused resource of older retired social workers who live perhaps in New York City with appropriate training to serve as mentors for parents, provide respite care, et cetera. So I think that's a terrific idea. Maybe we should talk about that a little more. So in closing, anything else you want us to remember before we say goodnight?
I just want to sort of say that I feel like the social work workforce is the one that can make the changes it needs in this particular system that I'm concerned about. The social work workforce has been the one to sort of support child welfare since the beginning. But more and more, we are the ones who are providing mental health services, certainly to the communities that we're concerned about. So I really feel we have to take this responsibility seriously, and as schools of social work really think about helping the workforce to be able to take on these problems in the most skilled way, and to be able to give child welfare, for example, a group of people who will stay and who are skilled enough to work with these families. So I really am hoping that that's what I'm going to spend the rest of my career doing, because I'm not going to be on the floor with families too much longer. So I'm really hoping that we can really provide the workforce that the field needs. So that's how I'm thinking about the last part of my career. So
Can't think of a better outcome than that. Brenda, thank you. Thank you so much. What a terrific, thought-provoking, wonderful session. I think you've given us real insight into how a scientist practitioner does her work and contributes to well-being. What I'll remember going away from this is one size does not fit all, for all the terrific reasons that you enumerated. And the other thing I'll take away is the Gandhi quote, which I had not heard before, that poverty is the worst form of violence. And that's where a lot of this begins. If we could just wake up to that and reallocate resources in a way to address those deficits that we can fix. It's within our grasp to fix them, right? So again, thank you. I'm sure everyone here is really as delighted as I am with this session. So extremely grateful to you. So excited that you're joining us as a full-time faculty member this July 1, and for all you will bring to our school and our community. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to do this talking about the stuff that's close to my heart. So thanks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like the series is a gift to me personally, that I get to chat with our faculty and really get to, it just doesn't matter how much we've talked before. I always learned something really wonderful and new through these conversations. So again, thanks to you and thanks to everybody who tuned in. We really appreciate your being here. Take care.